Welcome back to the Indiana Jones in History podcast. I'm your host, Justin Jacobs. Last time, we answered the question, who enabled Indiana Jones? Today, we're going to take on a question that is much more exciting. Who confronted Indiana Jones? And I promise you today, the fireworks are going to go off. Our last episode, there really wasn't a whole lot of acrimony. Surprisingly, we might think, if we're talking about the relationship between the Western archaeologist and his native hosts or the laborers who he employs, that, based on all we've heard about how they're thieves and this was immoral and whatnot, we might expect to find a lot more hostility and fisticuffs between the two sides. But surprisingly, we found that it was mostly lovey-dovey. There wasn't a whole lot of action going on, because if we move beyond the discourse of criminalization, we find out that these guys were not regarded as thieves, and there was a range of compensations, the so-called compensations of plunder, that offered the non-Western elites and lower classes some form of compensation that was viewed as equal to or more valuable than the value of the antiquity that was taken away. Okay, today things are going to change, because the value of that antiquity is going to rise astronomically, to the point where no compensation will be regarded as sufficient any longer to make up for the perceived value that is lost by the removal of the physical object. Okay? Now, when we talk about who confronted Indiana Jones, who obstructed the historical Indiana Jones, we first need to note two types of obstruction. Okay? One very straightforward and one very complex. The first type of obstruction that we see occurred at all times and all places, regardless of whether nationalism was in the air or not. From the very beginning of the very first Western archaeological expeditions, the locals had strategic fears about possible preparatory activities on the part of archaeologists that could one day prove useful to the foreign government if they ever wanted to undertake a military invasion of that land. And they were also worried that there could be diplomatic incidents if any harm befell the foreign archaeologist, who often was going into remote sites where the host government may not even have complete control over that area. It was possible they could run into bandits. It was possible they could die. And if that happened, you would have a diplomatic incident, an international incident on your hands that you would rather not have. Let's start with the strategic fears. Okay, you see these everywhere. Basically, as I've alluded to several times in the previous episodes, all foreign explorers undertook mapping, cartography, and surveying activities in the course of their travels. Now, they often said, I'm just doing this to further geographical knowledge. This is in service to politically disinterested science and scholarship. I'm filling in the blank spaces on the maps. Okay? But in reality, we know that any sort of a map, any sort of data on local conditions could potentially have a double use. It could also be used one day to facilitate a military invasion by a foreign power. Okay, even if the relations between the countries are friendly at the time, you never know what might happen in the future. And so we see this everywhere, at all times and places. I'll give you a few examples again from my own area of research: northwestern China and Xinjiang along the Silk Road, the Taklamakan Desert. Okay, Aurel Stein, on his first expedition in 1901, he noted the contrasting reception afforded him by the local civilian and military authorities in Xinjiang. He says, quote, "On the 19th, I went to call on Pan Zhen," Stein wrote in his diary, referring to the local civilian magistrate, "with whom I had a long and cheering interview. Later that same day, however, after a clearing in the weather revealed the outline of a nearby mountain range, Stein found that, quote, permission to use the ramparts of the Yangishar for theodolite observations was refused by the military commandant, evidently to Pan Zhen's regret." We see here the civil official. There's both civil and military local Chinese officials here at this oasis. The civil official has no problem with Stein wanting to do whatever he wants to do because of episode 3, the compensations of plunder, who enabled Indiana Jones. He's getting a lot in return for being nice to Stein. Social capital, political capital, economic capital. So he's fine if Stein wants to take measurements of the nearby mountain range. But the military commandant is the one who actually has jurisdiction over that permission. And he says no. As Stein says, evidently to the civil official's regret. Okay? always suspicion of militarily sensitive activities. Again, the Elgin Marbles, the Acropolis on which the Parthenon stood, was a military installation for the Ottomans. And that is why they refused entrance to Lord Elgin's men initially. Until eventually, this sort of backfired, and the Sultan got so mad that the local governor was doing that the local governor then overcompensated by allowing them to remove the actual sculptures. Another example, from this one from the Journal of Gustav Mannerheim, a Finnish member of Paul Pelliot's 1907 French expedition to Xinjiang, also reveals an acute interest on the part of Western archaeologists in the local defense capabilities and strategic infrastructure of the host countries. This is precisely what I'm going to read from Mannerheim's diary, is precisely what the host officials, the non-Western officials, are afraid of. They're not afraid of losing antiquities. All right? They're not afraid of that. It doesn't even bother them for the most part. What they are afraid of is this, quote, "The improvements necessary to make this road suitable for heavy vehicles are insignificant," Mannerheim notes in the oasis town of Yengi Hisar. On another occasion, he described, quote, "one more valley that crept up to within about 300 paces of the fortress and might someday afford welcome protection to an advancing enemy." He then crosses over what he describes as, quote, "an easily destructible bridge over the moat about 35 feet wide." Now, you really think he's just noting this stuff down in the interests of geographical posterity? Oh, this is good knowledge for the world to know that there's an easily destructible bridge over the moat, that this is where an advancing army could hide one day? Come on. The host officials are right to be suspicious about this sort of thing. This is why Afghanistan said no. Over and over again to Stein. No, 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 and no. You're not coming in because I know what you're going to do. Yes, you're going to look for antiquities. Yes, you're going to do stuff in the service of science. And yes, I believe you're probably sincere in that belief. But you're also going to do this stuff. And I don't want you mapping our passes. There was also fear of diplomatic incidents. Okay, and sometimes obstructionary efforts would be related to this. Injury to a foreign national who hails from a stronger empire than yours can set off international headaches. Okay, the Chinese had a lot of experience of this. The Boxer War was set off by German missionaries being killed and attacked by rural discontents who targeted them in remote areas where there was scant prospect of local protection. And that set off a whole international conflagration. Remember, I talked about Oral Stein's passport, the Chinese passport he had, and those little red circles next to the most important characters that the local Chinese official wanted to pay attention to. All right, afford him protections in accordance with the treaty. In other words, don't let him die. Don't let him die on your watch. Okay? That was one of the greatest fears. Because if he dies on your watch, it's going to be an international incident, and we don't want to have an international incident with the more powerful empire than ours. Okay? The important takeaway point here, though, is that this type of obstruction had nothing to do with antiquities. Repeat, nothing to do with the removal of antiquities. And yet it was by far the most common and often the only type of obstruction of Western archaeologists prior to World War I. It was visible and evident in all times and places, regardless of what sort of ideas about cultural sovereignty or lack thereof were bouncing around in the minds of all the people associated with any archaeological expedition. Now, the type of obstruction that you all came to hear about, the second type of obstruction, resisting the removal of antiquities on legal or moral principle. That was very rare prior to World War I. And it also required very specific conditions in order to take place. You must have two conditions. One, there must be a perception of cultural continuity with the artifact being removed on both sides. The foreign archaeologist is removing something because he sees himself in it somehow. He sees Western influence or some sort of connection to Western civilization, or the Aryan race, or whatever. There's a million ways to make the connection that this has something to do with my heritage. He somehow sees some evidence of himself in it. But the host also has to see that. Okay? And that doesn't always happen. In China, it does. Outside of China, it's actually usually the opposite. The locals, both the elites, the educated elites, and the illiterate peasants, often don't see any connection with the artifact being removed. They say that is a completely alien culture. In religion, in dress, in speech, in food, in customs, in appearance, everything. That's not us. So when it's taken away, they really don't care all that much. And they're like, wow, look at all the compensations that we're getting back in return for facilitating the excavation and removal of stuff that we have no interest in anyways. Eventually, though, they will begin to think like the Westerners, because they'll start going to Western universities. They'll be educated with a Western curriculum. They'll aspire to be like the Western countries and modernize on those lines, and they're going to imbibe the Western narrative of civilization, the grandmaster narrative of where Western civilization came from and what your place is in it, and you want to be a part of that. You don't want to fall behind and be regarded as barbarian and whatnot, and uncivilized, and have extraterritoriality continue forever, so you jump on board. And at that point, you too have a perception of cultural continuity with the artifact being removed. The Westerners say the ancient pharaohs were the precursors to the Greeks, and thus they're in the narrative of Western civilization, and they're ours. Well, eventually, the Egyptian elites, not the Egyptian commoners, but the Egyptian elites will also subscribe to that and say, yeah, the ancient pharaohs were the origin of civilization. Our civilization too, and we do connect with that, just like you do. And when that happens, you have the recipe for confrontation, because both sides see a new value in that object. Okay? It's not yet quite nationalism, but both sides have a perception of cultural continuity. That's important. If you don't have that, there's no possibility of conflict over the removal of the antiquity. Now, the next ingredient you have to have in this mix, you have to have some sense of political entitlement on the part of the host country to the culture being represented by the artifact being excavated, i.e. nationalism. Just having a perception of cultural continuity with the artifact being removed on both sides is not enough, because the Chinese were like that too, and they were just fine with the foreigners taking stuff away prior to World War I. You also need to have nationalism on the part of the host officials, who they themselves say, not only do we identify with this, but we have a birthright to it. It belongs to us for no other reason than it was found within the arbitrarily drawn borders of the state that we live in today, and I was born in this state too. That's it. That's nationalism. When do these two conditions arise? All right, we have cultural versus political stimulants. The first cultural stimulant, like I already said, the perception of cultural continuity, that comes after the first generation of native non-Western elites who are educated in the West and begin to share Western cultural values. The second cultural stimulant, which grows out of the first, is that once you have that first generation of non-Western educated elites who are Westernized, then they go ahead and create their first museums in non-Western countries, in Egypt, in Constantinople, in China. And they also enact antiquities preservation laws on paper, if not always on the ground. Okay? The political stimulants, these all occur after World War I. The political transformations that occur from World War I. What is so significant about World War I? I keep on referencing it as some ominous preview. Well, here we go. Finally, we're going to learn what World War I is all about. World War I will be the first time that the Western empires will be seriously weakened. They beat the shit out of each other for 4 years. And they had more firepower and ability to beat the shit out of each other than they ever had before. So the European powers, even the victors, are pretty devastated after World War I. This is why it'll be the Americans actually who step in. And in the 1920s and 30s, it's mostly American money and American initiative in the realm of archaeological excavations and expeditions. And the Europeans sort of take a back seat to the Americans, because they're exhausted in every single possible way after World War I. So the Western empires will be weakened significantly after World War I, at least the empires that had a physical presence on the ground throughout the Middle East and China Britain and France and Germany and Russia and all of them. Also, they'll lose the moral high ground. Okay? The Westerners will lose the moral high ground after World War I. All that stuff we talked about political capital, admiring the Western modernization and science and how it made you strong and powerful, that was an object of unqualified admiration previously. After World War I, some people, including Westerners themselves, will say, wow, this is what science led to? All that progress you kept talking about for all those years, and it led to this? Look what you guys did to each other. Look what you did to the world. This is horrid. I don't want that path anymore. That's not across the board, of course, but what you see, what I want to get at is that there are cracks in the infallibility of the Westerners, which have not been evident prior to World War I. Oh, there were small things here and there. The Japanese beat the Russians and whatnot. Okay, that was a sort of a crack in the infallibility of the white man. But World War I is really going to do it. Okay? Now, specific political stimulants to both the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire, which are where 90% of all archaeological expeditions are taking place in the Middle East under the Ottoman Empire and in China, which is actually the Qing Empire, not the Chinese Empire, it's the Qing Empire. Specific to the Ottomans, after World War I, they will be dismembered. Torn apart. They lose the war. They come in on the side of Germany. Really bad decision. They got very little out of it, but they went in on the side of Germany, and when you're part of the losers, they share the same fate as Germany. They get dismembered. No more colonies. And out of the former Ottoman Empire, just like out of the former German Empire, you are taken apart, surgically removed into constituent individual states. Okay? Now these new states that are created are in theory supposed to be nation states, the perfect alignment of nation, an abstract nation, which is a fairly new concept. Okay? And political boundaries, one nation, one ethnic group for each state. That's the ideal. Never is achieved in practice, ever. Okay? But these new states now are in desperate need of a new identity. And it can't be the same cultural identity that the Ottoman Empire before them had, because that's over, that's gone, that's delegitimized. You need a brand new national identity, and you got to construct it from scratch. Art and antiquities and new stuff that comes out of the ground will be perfect to fill that identity. Okay? More on that as this episode goes on. Specific to China, it's not going to get dismembered because they join World War I on the right side, the winner side. So they don't get dismembered, but they do get betrayed by the Western powers. They thought they were going to get Germany's colonial holdings in China back, and instead those holdings are given to Japan. And that's a great disillusionment for the first generation of young Chinese who have been educated abroad and are westernized in the full sense of the word. And they'll be disillusioned with the promises of the West. And then the Chinese themselves also underwent a revolution that actually doesn't have anything to do with World War I. It was in 1911, in which the old imperial dynasty was overthrown and the imperial order entirely was done with. So they too have undergone a radical identity change. Even though they weren't dismembered into a new state, they underwent an ideological revolution that said anything from the old imperial order is no longer fit for us. And so ideally, they too need to create a brand new identity from scratch. Okay? So basically, the emergence of a new state that needs a new identity. That's what's going to create fertile ground for nationalism and the changing value of archaeological artifacts, which will come to define that new nation, which is so desperate in need of an identity. The end result is that the merging of this new nationalist ideology and political activism, once you see the cracks in the Western armor and realize you can actually maybe make some progress that you couldn't make before in catching up to them, this nationalist ideology and political activism will replace the former culturalist mentality. Nationalism will infuse artifacts and art with a value so high, literally priceless, that no compensation of plunder can fill its void if it is lost from our state. It will be political suicide for any politician to let it go now. Because that bodhisattva's head is now elevated into an emblem of the Chinese nation in whole. It was never previously regarded as such. This is a brand new idea. We're brainwashed now through education to think that these national identities go back into the mists of time. They don't. 19th century at the earliest, 20th century oftentimes for many places in the world. That's it. Great-grandfather's age is when these ideas came into play. Okay? But if the antiquity is now seen in that light as a representative of this abstract new nation, which is necessary to create a new identity for a new state that has undergone revolution or been dismembered by World War I, then it's literally priceless. And anyone who acquiesces in its removal from that country will be seen as a traitor to the nation. And anyone who is a foreigner who removes it will be seen as a thief, a criminal, who has injured that nation. A brand new way of looking at this. And let's get a little preview of the major differences between what's going to happen in the Middle East and what's going to happen in China, the two major areas that serve as backdrop for our story. In the Ottoman Empire, both the Ottoman Empire itself and then after World War I, its successor states, independent successor states, you will have official government obstruction. Officials working in the state will strive to obstruct the Western archaeologists. Now, why is that interesting? Because in China, it's going to be the opposite. It'll be non-governmental activism undertaken by university scholars, mostly in Beijing, who will shame their government into obstructing the foreigners. It won't be the government itself, because the government in China for the next 20 years after World War I, for 30 years after World War I, is mired in civil war, anarchy, and warlords. And then the Japanese invade. It's a total mess. The government doesn't have time or the energy or the resources to go after Western archaeologists, even though they pay lip service to the new nationalist ideals. It's going to be scholars outside of government who have to repeatedly take to the press, public media, to remind their leaders, hey, if you're truly nationalist, you need to protect these antiquities now. You can't keep treating them like they were treated in the old days. Okay, but in the Ottoman government and then in the independent states that follow, they're relatively more stable and unified. Relatively, all right, not absolutely, than the Chinese. But the Chinese are mired in civil war and chaos and anarchy all the way from 1916 until 1949 when the communists take over and finally bring back stability to the land. Let's begin our story. The first rumblings of obstruction. All right, there are a couple of examples that predate World War I that we have to deal with first. The first example comes with Heinrich Schliemann and his excavations at Troy. Our time frame is the 1870s. All right, when we're dealing with the Middle East, the time frame is always earlier than China, because all the earliest archaeological expeditions went first to the Middle East, because that was a lot closer to the Europeans than China was. China, you don't really get expeditions and the exodus of art and antiquities until the turn of the 20th century, really. All right, so Middle East first. Heinrich Schliemann at Troy on the Anatolian Peninsula, 1870s. This is a classic case of crudely educated new money tycoon such as Schliemann, a German-born American. He'll be a German-American. He becomes naturalized as a German citizen, born into a poor German family, doesn't get a very good education growing up, but becomes fabulously wealthy by speculating in the gold rush and the Crimean War as a profiteer. He now wants to launder his money through the patronage of cultural pursuits. And he becomes obsessed with Homer and the Greeks. The Greeks, the best source of cultural respectability is to do something that valorizes the Greeks. Okay? So he travels the world. He retires in his 50s or something and starts traveling the world. And in 1868, he meets an American consul working in a consulate, Frank Calvert, in the Dardanelles, which is this narrow strip of land and an isthmus that is on the maritime approach to Constantinople, a little bit east of Greece, okay? He stops in the Dardanelles, which is near Troy, all right, the ancient site of Troy. They don't know that at the time. And he finds that Frank Calvert has already been searching for Troy in the Hisarlik region of the Anatolian Peninsula for quite some time. But Frank Calvert is running out of money. Okay, and Schliemann sees a golden opportunity to start funding the digs and take over it himself. Both he and Calvert believe that Homer's Iliad and the narration of the Trojan War is absolutely historically authentic, and that the site of Troy must exist somewhere. Many scholars believe that it's largely a literary myth, with a few elements of history, but a lot of literary embellishment, and it would be foolhardy to try and identify an actual site mentioned in the poem. Schliemann and Calvert were not of that opinion. Now, the date of when this meeting takes place is very important. 1868 is when they meet. Because we know that's 22 years after the Imperial Ottoman Museum was first founded in Constantinople in 1846. That was the first non-Western museum, 1846. The Imperial Ottoman Museum is built out of the Hagia Sophia, a Greek Orthodox church in Constantinople. That was where the Janissary mannequins and the old weapons were held, or put on display. It's also 5 years after the Bulak Museum is opened up in Cairo. So you got 2 museums already that have been around for a while by the time that Schliemann meets Calvert in Anatolia. Okay? They're in the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire already has 2 major museums that have existed, one for 22 years, one for 5. Now, the laws that the Ottomans have passed regarding antiquities preservation aren't always enforced, and the museum collections pale by comparison with the Western museum collections. But still, they exist. They're there, and that's an important fact. Westerners like Schliemann, as we will see, take no notice of them whatsoever. They're not ready to change their minds about what they think about non-Western museums. Now, 5 years after he meets Calvert in 1873, Schliemann is well into his digs at the site of Troy at Hissarlik, and he uncovers what he deems to be Priam's treasure. He imagines that this is a treasure that was actually worn by the king of Troy, as mentioned in Homer's epic. All right? Highly unlikely. Regardless, that's what he does. And he's quite the showman. Goes all over the world, parading it around. And he smuggles it out of the country, not telling the Ottomans that he's found it at all. That is a pretty bold flaunting of Ottoman antiquities laws. The Ottomans will learn of the existence of Priam's treasure. Priam's treasure, by the way, is this collection of gold plates, cups, jewelry, headdresses, this sort of thing, earrings. They learn of the existence of Priam's treasure for the first time in a European newspaper that has a picture of Mrs. Schliemann wearing it. Pretty insulting to the Ottomans. Not standard archaeological practice for his own day either, in case you're wondering. This realization that Schliemann had smuggled this out of the country and was letting his wife wear it inaugurates the first real diplomatic tussle over the ownership of antiquities between Western and non-Western elites. This is really the first time that they're going to clash. But remember, before we get into it, it is just a battle between the Western and Westernized Ottoman elites, not the culturally indifferent Muslim masses. This is the 1% versus the 1% of 2 different societies. It's not the Muslim nations. It's not the Ottoman nation or the Turks in general. Okay? These are elites fighting elites. Now, in response to Ottoman calls for the return of Priam's treasure, Schliemann decides to donate it to what he refers to as the Greek nation of his Homeric imagination. He thinks this is going to get him out of trouble. Generous, heroic act, returning it to the Greeks. But modern Greece turns out to care more about maintaining pragmatic positive relationship with the Ottoman Empire, which is right next to Greece, geographically, than any sort of romantic ideas about ancient Greece. And when the Ottomans file an international lawsuit in Greek courts against Schliemann for the return of Priam's treasure, the Greeks support the lawsuit and order seizure of the treasure. Schliemann is stunned that the Greeks would do that, so he takes the advice of the American consul in the region and absconds again. The consul tells him, what is the advice? It would be worse than throwing away the articles which you have discovered, he wrote, than to permit any part of them to go into the absurd collection of rubbish which the Turks call their quote-unquote museum. Faced with such a determined foe, the Ottomans prove content to fall back on our framework of the compensations of plunder. In this case, it really is plunder without quotes around plunder and no irony at all. This is in fact one of the few times in which you can say the compensations of plunder framework is adequate to explain what goes on, and it really was plunder, because it was regarded as theft and a flouting of actual laws that existed at the time, against the will of the host country. But what happens is the Ottomans still prove content to fall back on the compensations of plunder, and they work out a financial deal with Schliemann. Schliemann will pay them after the fact several £1,000s, and he'll fund all future digs that the Ottomans will take at Troy and allow all future stuff to stay in the Ottoman Empire. Okay? So this is your first example. The Ottomans now, the situation in the Ottoman Empire is now similar to the situation in China prior to World War I. That is to say, there's now a perception of cultural continuity on the sides of both elites. The Chinese elites, the Ottoman elites, and the Western elites. But still, this doesn't mean that the problem is intractable, because there's no nationalism yet. And so there's still the possibility that a compensation, some form of capital, economic, political, social capital, can be worked out as a barter arrangement for an antiquity to leave the land. And that's exactly what happens. The Ottomans realize they're not going to get this back. Let's get some compensation in return for it. They won't do that in 40 years. And that brings us to our next example. It was the Princeton archaeologist Howard Butler and his excavations at Sardis. From 1910 to 1914, Princeton archaeologist Howard Butler is excavating the Greek, Lydian, Persian, and Roman ruins at Sardis, about 200 miles southeast of the site of Troy, still on the Anatolian Peninsula. This is still the Ottoman Empire, okay? Right before the eve of World War I. Wealthy New York financiers like J.P. Morgan, who helped fund the dig, intended for most of the artifacts that were found from Sardis to go into the Metropolitan Museum in New York. But unfortunately, the outbreak of World War I puts a halt to the dig, and all American personnel is withdrawn. Then after World War I ends, war immediately breaks out in 1919 between the Greeks and the Turks. The Turks are now an independent state because they've been dismembered. Instead of the Ottoman Empire, we're now talking about the Republic of Turkey. Okay? And the Greeks were acting on promises from their Western allies that if they invaded Turkey, the Westerners would help them. Britain and France would help them. And they could get more of Turkey's territory. So the Greeks in 1919 invade Turkey. And for 3 years, war rages between the Greeks and the Turks. And as the armies get closer and closer to the vicinity of Sardis, the site of Sardis, the Sardis Committee, back in New York, decides to unilaterally remove 58 crates of artifacts to New York. Say, well, this is dangerous. The armies are closing in. The Turks can't take care of this. We're going to remove it for safekeeping. And in this, they have a clear expectation that they can act like Schliemann did before them 40 years earlier. Take first, and then negotiate later from a position of strength. But this is newly independent and now nationalist Turkey, not the old Ottoman Empire with a culturalist mentality. And Turkey shows that it will fight much harder than the Ottomans before them because the artifacts are now so much more important to its national identity. Essential to its national identity. So they give the Sardis Committee in New York an ultimatum. No more American archaeologists will ever be allowed to dig in Turkey until all 58 crates are returned and we decide who gets what. The Americans balk. And they offer instead to say, how about we keep them? Nice offer, but how about we instead keep them in New York, put them in the Metropolitan, and we'll be sure to put a placard on each display that says, gift of the Turkish government, giving you credit for it. Turkey says, to hell with you. This isn't the old days anymore. This is a part of our national identity now. And they insist that the crates are returned, and their leverage is to say you will never dig in Turkey again, ever. Well, guess what happened? When the natives were willing to stand their ground and say no over and over again and not say no, okay, what kind of compensations can we get? When they stopped doing that and just said no, and never stopped saying no, the Westerners gave in. The Americans send back all 58 crates. And Turkey decides on the division unilaterally. In fact, the Americans were lucky to get anything at all. When the crates finally came back, many Turkish politicians in Ankara were in favor of taking 100% of the Sardis artifacts, before finally they were overruled in the interest of maintaining friendly relations and not going back on your word with the Americans. That's the last time that you're going to see partage in action with an independent Middle Eastern country. Okay? Sardis affair reaches its climax in 1921, 1922. Okay? So Turkey is technically the first country to really obstruct, to stand its ground, to stand on the new nationalist principles and say, no. But they still divide the fines. The first 100% obstruction of a foreign excavation in which nothing is divided is actually also one of the most famous excavations ever, the tomb of Tutankhamun. Howard Carter, the British Egyptologist Howard Carter. And our time frame here now picks up right after the Sardis affair, 1922 to 1924. And our focus here is not going to be on Carter's very interesting career prior to the discovery, although it is very interesting. There's lots we could talk about. The focus is going to be on the management of the site of the tomb of King Tut, well, Pharaoh Tut, after it was discovered in November 1922. Okay, in November 1922, Carter discovers the tomb. Well, his Arab water boy discovers it, but, they don't get any credit. Carter discovers the tomb, and his patron, the Earl of Carnarvon, Mr. Downton Abbey, who lives in Highclere Castle, his patron, the Earl of Carnarvon, immediately treats the site like his own personal property. He comes in, he sells the London Times, a monopoly on journalistic access to the site. All news reports about what's being found in there will be sold to the London Times first. The Earl of Carnarvon says, What? There's nothing wrong with this. This is my site. I paid for it. I funded the excavations. And he's thinking in the old culturalist mode and private property mode. This doesn't belong to the Egyptian nation. An abstract thing doesn't even exist. That's absurd. And he treats it like his own personal property. Like all elites similar to him had done previously throughout the world. It's not like he's uniquely arrogant. That was common practice. But in February 1922, we have a new context that arises here. The British, who had imposed a protectorate, a military protectorate over Egypt during World War I, sort of, invoke crisis situation, and you say, we're going to take over Egypt temporarily during the war. The British had finally, after the war, bowed down to Egyptian nationalist agitation and protest and granted Egypt its independence. That is to say, Egypt gets its independence just 9 months before the tomb of Tutankhamun is found. For Carter, the timing is horrible. He had been digging in the Valley of the Kings for 6 years prior to this. If he had found the tomb of King Tut in any of his previous 6 seasons of digging, a good portion of the artifacts in that tomb would have ended up in London and New York, the British Museum and the Metropolitan, as originally intended by the Earl of Carnarvon, the patron of the dig. Absolutely. But now Egypt's independence. Nationalism is the order of the day, and new nationalist ideas say, we need a new Egyptian identity different from the past. And antiquities are going to fill a big part of that identity. So a struggle breaks out between the new nationalist politicians in Cairo and their loyal French director of the Antiquities Services, Pierre Lecoq. The French were the Europeans of choice to run antiquities services. Usually the Ottomans didn't do it themselves. They would hire the French. And the French were loyal to the Ottomans, where they got their paycheck from. They did what the Ottomans told them to do. Okay? So a struggle breaks out between the Egyptian politicians in Cairo and their French director of Antiquities Service, Pierre Lecoq, and Howard Carter. The conflict is not over necessarily the destination of the artifacts, where they're going to end up. They don't even get that far to initiate such discussions, whether or not any will be allowed to go abroad, before tensions erupt over the daily management of the guests who will be afforded access to the site. Carter repeatedly bristles at having to entertain a revolving door of dignitaries dictated by Cairo. He also bristled at having to entertain a revolving door of international celebrities and friends of the Earl of Carnarvon, who brought him in there, and, for him, the tomb was a form of social capital. He could show it off to his friends. Look what I paid for. Look what my man found. And it was a form of social capital to invite everyone and his mom to the tomb in the Valley of the Kings and show it off. and get an exclusive invitation from the Earl of Carnarvon to go visit it. And Carter was always annoyed at that. I'm a scholar, not a tour guide. But he's not going to call out his patron and a white man, the Earl of Carnarvon. Carter's annoyed at the Earl of Carnarvon, but he's not going to call him out. He will call out the Egyptian politicians, however, when they act the exact same way. When the Egyptian politicians say, it's not a form of social capital, it's a form of political capital. We want to show important international dignitaries and our own allies and people we want to impress in a political arena. We want you to host them at the tomb. Well, Carter bristles in exactly the same way he bristled when he had to host the Earl of Carnarvon's guests, but this time, he's more than willing to call out the Egyptians in public and say, screw you! Or he won't do that to the Earl of Carnarvon. And so when he has to entertain a revolving door of dignitaries dictated by Cairo, his blood pressure rises until finally he explodes one day in early 1924 when he's ordered to submit his own guest list. He actually has his own people he wants to bring as well, for official vetting by the Egyptian politicians in Cairo. His response when he's asked to submit his guest list for approval by a non-Western people, he closes and locks the iron gate that he had erected in front of the tomb. And says, fine, like a little 5-year-old. No one gets in! What's the response of the Egyptians? Well, the Inspector of Antiquities of Lower Egypt, a job that Carter had actually once held in a previous life, tells him that he fervently hoped that he did not, quote, get an order to blow up the disgustingly strong door by means of which you have locked up the treasures of Egypt's ancestors. That's a nationalist mindset. These are now Egypt's ancestors. They belong to us, the Egyptians. We identify with them. That's the elites talking. The Muslim masses still don't really do that. Nonetheless, that's the influence of nationalism. A few weeks later, that order came. Egyptian soldiers were sent in to take control of the tomb, cut the locks that Carter had erected over the tomb, and Carter is forced to leave the country, and he saves face by going on a lecture tour around the world. Pierre Lecoq, the French director of the Antiquities Service for the Egyptians, speaks on behalf of the Egyptians when he tells Carter, quote, the government no longer discusses, but conveys to you its decision. Indeed, it does. Okay, all that changes are ideas, not the imbalance of power, military or political or economic power. Okay, like Afghanistan, if any country is willing to say no, the Westerners will have to leave. They weren't willing to say no in the old days because the type of compensations they could get were so valuable and varied, and the value of the antiquities was precious but not priceless. Now, the value of the antiquities is priceless. And so no value of any compensation can be sufficient recompense. Now, after King Tut, we turn our attention to James Henry Breasted, an American Egyptologist who is going to be trying to undertake new projects in Egypt, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. 4 independent states in the Middle East, the 4 major independent states of the Middle East after World War I. And our time frame here is now going to be 1926 until 1935. James Henry Breasted works on behalf of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute. All right. As an American, he represents the wave of American money and initiative after World War I. And the American museums now are desperate to fill their empty shelves. They have very much an inferiority complex about their museums as compared to the glorious European museums. And they feel like they've come into the game very late. We need to get as much as we possibly can now to catch up to the Europeans. Okay? But Breasted will encounter increasing resistance across the Middle East due to what we scholars refer to as the King Tut effect. Okay? Egypt and Turkey will rebuff him by the end of the 1920s. Iran and Iraq will gradually impose terms that prompt the total withdrawal of Breasted's team by 1936. In each case, Breasted and his circle of colleagues will respond with an ugly, racist invective that harkens straight back to the days of Schliemann 60 years earlier. For instance, the day after the government seizure of Tut's tomb, Breasted's son, Charles, described the affair as, quote, only another evidence of Near Eastern bravado, of the decline of Occidental prestige, and of the intoxicating effect of sudden freedom and independence upon an ignorant, decadent, mongrel people, totally unfit for self-rule. Oh, I feel dirty even letting those words come out of my mouth. It's so horrible. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who had funded Breasted's previous digs in Egypt and was eager to fund more, thought little of the Arabs and Turks with whom they were obliged to work. The men of both races, he said, seemed to have great facility in standing, sitting, or lying in the sun and doing nothing. Breasted himself was convinced that the Egyptians could never have obstructed could have obstructed Howard Carter on their own. The Egyptians aren't capable of doing something like that, standing up to the white man. He was convinced that it was Pierre Lecoq, the French director of the Egyptian Antiquities Services, who had brought it all about. It was just the French begrudging the British a famous discovery. And it was French treachery. Well, no, Pierre Lecoq carried out orders from his employer, which was the Egyptian government. And then in 1934, when Breasted is faced with demands from Tehran, and this is in Iran now, to alter the arrangement of the division of artifacts from the sites of Persepolis, which had become the major site in central Iran from which the nationalist new identity of the Iranian state was going to be drawn. Breasted informed his son in response that, quote, "The Oriental has to be told very decidedly where he gets off." When the Oriental refused to be told where to get off, Breasted reached the following conclusion. "To put it very mildly," he wrote to one of his friends, "if there are any loathsome vermin anywhere on the surface of the earth worse than the Persians, I do not know where it might be." When the Iraqis adopted the same policy in 1935, Breasted called them an ignorant and fanatical people. All this invective was to no avail. And this is the argument of an op-ed piece that I wrote for the Washington Post last December in 2017. I start off posing the rhetorical question. In 1936, we are told, in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones outran an oversized boulder, recovered a golden idol from the jungles of Peru, and beat the Nazis to the Lost Ark. Which one of these events is least plausible? And the answer, of course, is a trick question. 1936 is the least plausible element of that equation. Because 1936, the year that the Indiana Jones franchise is said to begin, it opens up in 1936, Indiana Jones going to Peru to recover that golden idol, and then he eventually ends up in Egypt, right? The year the franchise begins, the chosen dates and setting of the movies are inherently implausible. James Henry Breasted was kicked out of all the Middle Eastern countries by 1936. Howard Carter was kicked out of Egypt by 1924. Indiana Jones can't do what he does in 1936. But that's more on that for the 5th episode, in which we asked, did Hollywood get it right? No. All right, now, let's move over to China. All right, in China, the timing of the obstruction was the same, 1920s, 1930s. But the source of the obstruction was not. In China, it wasn't people in the employ of the official government who obstructed the foreigners. It fell to jaded, westernized Chinese scholars, usually professors like myself, mostly in Beijing, who were disillusioned with Western promises. It fell to them to repeatedly shame and pressure their own politicians, who were more occupied with fighting wars, to accept a new valuation of the artifacts in their country. Roy Chapman Andrews, an American paleontologist working for the American Museum of Natural History in New York, who we're going to get to, he plays a fairly significant role in this story. He recognized the unofficial nature of the obstruction that occurred in China. Calling it, trying to denigrate it, he said its organized front was, quote, an entirely unofficial organization that had managed to arouse such popular indignation that the government authorities dared not ignore its activities. It's a perfect summary, actually, of what's going to happen. An entirely unofficial organization that managed to arouse such popular indignation that the government authorities dared not ignore its activities, because if you ignore it, you will lose the nationalist credentials that you need to be regarded as the rightful ruler of post-World War I, post-1911 revolution China. Now, the first expedition to China after World War I is led by Harvard art historian Langdon Warner. Warner's goal is to fill the new Fogg Museum at Harvard University with art and antiquities from the old Silk Road route, the same place that Orlstein, Paul Paleo, Albert von Lecoq had spent 15 years excavating from 1900 to 1915. Now, the warlord government in Beijing issues the visa without question each time to all of these foreign explorers. And in 1923 to 24, Langdon Warner undertakes his first expedition to Dunhuang, one of the major sites in northwestern China. And he cuts away 12 Buddhist cave murals inside a cave that had been preserved there for over 1,000 years. And he says that White Russian graffiti in the caves justified his actions. A little bit of background here of what's going on. The Russian Civil War breaks out in 1917. It goes on for 6 years till 1923. And it's between the White Russians, the old conservative defenders of the imperial order, and the Red Russians, the more radical supporters of the Bolshevik, more or less. And the Civil War goes on all over the old Russian Empire, into Siberia, spills over into Mongolia, and it spills over into Xinjiang, northwestern China, where all the archaeological excavations are. And when the White Russians spill over into Xinjiang, the Red Russians are afraid that they're going to regroup and attack the Red Russians from Xinjiang territory. So they tell the governor of Xinjiang, hey, you need to take care of these White Russians or we're going to invade your province so we can kill them. So the governor of Xinjiang, a poor, impoverished, distant province, doesn't know what he's going to do. He tricks the White Russians into going to Dunhuang, an oasis way out in the desert. And he says this is a natural prison for them. Once we get them there and abandon them there, they can't leave without our help because you can't possibly march out of the oasis into the desert on your own. You'll die. So the White Russians get tricked into being jailed at Dunhuang, a natural desert fortress. And they spend their time writing Russian obscenities in Cyrillic on the caves, on the cave murals at Dunhuang. Langdon Warner sees this and he says, okay, yep, that's all the justification I need to know that China can't take care of its own art. I'm going to cut them out now, drastic measures. I'm going to cut them out and remove them to safekeeping in America for the Fogg Museum. Now, he does his first expedition, and it seems successful to him. He has 12 cave murals. A lot of them are damaged in the process, but nonetheless, he's got some stuff. And Harvard says, good work. Why don't you go back and try and do it again this time and not destroy them so much? Bring back better samples that are better preserved. So he goes back in 1925 for a second expedition. Word of his removal that occurred on his first expedition now begins to spread for the first time among the professors at various Beijing universities. Okay, this is the first time something's been brazenly removed from China after World War I. The Beijing professors learn about it. They attach their own professor, Chen Wanli, a professor of medicine, to go along with the expedition and take notes on what they're doing. And then he also calls the Minister of Education, one of these scholars calls the Minister of Education and asks him if he will send a telegram all along the route that Langdon Warner's team is going to take to, quote, provide these friends with ample protection and courteous treatment, but on no account allow them to touch any historical relics. And that's all they needed to do. It was a success. The local officials indeed followed the letter of the telegram and did not allow Langdon Warner or his men to touch any historical relics, much less remove them from the country. It was that simple. If they wanted to do that 20 years ago, they could have sent out a telegram 20 years ago, and they would have obstructed Orlstein. It's not because the Western powers were militarily stronger and economically more wealthy, although they were. It was because of the compensations of plunder barter dynamic. And now, the price of the antiquity exceeds the price of any compensation they can get in return. The telegram goes out. He's done for. Warner returns home in 1925 empty-handed and is effusively apologizing to all of his donors and funders for being the first major failure in China. After Warner comes the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin. He did 3 expeditions to Xinjiang back in the day. Now he's back after 30 years and he wants to do one more. And he brings along a huge Swedish and German team of geologists and various types of scientists. they're going to what they want to do is map a trans-Eurasian air route for Lufthansa, which has given them a lot of money for their expedition. He returns to Beijing. This is 1926, just 1 year after Warner. He returns to Beijing, and the warlord in Beijing, Zhang Zuolin, hands out a visa without fuss. He can benefit from it. He gets money for the visa, and he gets to be seen as a supporter of Western science. But the same Beijing University professors now learn of Hedin's return, and they demand that the warlord government revise the stipulations in the agreement with Hedin to include the first ever Chinese co-director of an expedition. Not only that, they say you need to attach a Chinese scholarly team that is equal in number to the German and Swedish team that Hedin had. This is unprecedented. They're saying Hedin has to share complete power with a Chinese co-director. This has never happened before. Okay? And you're going to have to take along Chinese professors and students who are going to do work also on the expedition, just like the Germans and the Swedes. Is Hedin going to put up with this? Yes, he is. He realizes that there's nothing he can do. You can't shoot your way out of this. If these are the demands, these are the demands. And if they won't budge, they won't budge. So he bows down to the demands. And the result is the creation of the 1927 Sino-Swedish Northwest Scientific Survey, the first hyphenated expedition ever. Sino-Swedish. Huang Wenbi, a Chinese member of the expedition, later wrote in his diary, quote, "Our task was twofold. On the one hand, we were to supervise the foreigners, and on the other hand, we were to carry out scientific investigations. The order in which these priorities was expressed was not a coincidence. Supervise the foreigners, then undertake scientific investigations." This was an unprecedented sharing of power and the recognition of the equality of non-Western archaeologists with the Western archaeologist. Hedin will become the model in 1927 that all other foreign archaeologists will be expected to follow. He sets a precedent. And he's still fondly remembered by the Chinese today as a result. He's the first penitent imperialist, so to speak, who changed his ways and conformed to the new nationalist environment in China. And they were so thrilled of their victory over Hedin that the Chinese even issued a special commemorative postage stamp for the Sino-Swedish expedition that was sold to the public to commemorate it, because it was such a landmark event. Now, Roy Chapman Andrews is going to be the first Westerner to succumb to what we might refer to as the Hedin effect, in contrast to the King Tut effect. Roy Chapman Andrews, as we said, was a paleontologist for the American Museum of Natural History in New York. His so-called Central Asiatic expeditions have been exploring Inner and Outer Mongolia since 1921. They did a lot of them. Now, the original agenda, why he went out to Inner and Outer Mongolia, which is just to China's northern frontier, and Chinese authority in these regions waxed and waned over the years that he was actually doing the expeditions, the original agenda was to provide evidence to confirm Henry Osborn. His theory, Henry Osborn is the director of the American Museum of Natural History. He had a theory, a very racist theory about the origins of humankind. Henry Osborn really did not want to find the fossilized skeletal remains of the missing link between apes and Homo sapiens. He was hoping that it would not be found in Africa, because he didn't want a black ancestor for the first modern humans, Homo sapiens. He really wanted a white one. And so his best hope for that was to find it in Mongolia, an Asian genesis for the missing link between apes and Homo sapiens. Andrews found nothing of the sort. What he did find, by accident, were fossilized dinosaur bones, which he was able to leverage into popular interest in the press. He was very much a celebrity in his own day. And he undertook many expeditions back to Mongolia on the strength of having found these fossilized dinosaur eggs. And he had some of the first celebrity endorsements as well. Ford would donate motor cars to his expedition, and then they would run advertisements saying, Roy Chapman Andrews says that our motor cars worked great even in Mongolia. You too should buy one. It's like the SUVs of our day. You got to buy an SUV or four-wheel drive, even though you're only going to drive it on paved suburban roads. He had Abercrombie and Fitch endorsements too. Abercrombie and Fitch, before they started, coming up with clothes to show off the skin of prepubescent adolescents, they used to actually be an outdoor outfitter, sort of like REI or something like that, or Dick's Sporting Goods, in which they would sell tents and boots and all that sort of stuff. Now, in 1928, the first time that Andrews comes back after Hedin has bowed to the demands of the Chinese scholars in Beijing, Andrews comes back. He's well aware of what Hedin had done. But he says, I can avoid Hedin's fate. Just watch. He's quite an arrogant man, actually. And Andrews says, I can avoid Hedin's fate by sneaking out of Beijing without any fanfare or press or attention whatsoever. Meets privately with the warlord of Beijing, who, surprise, surprise, gives him yet another visa. But on his return from this expedition, Andrews now finds that the Chinese scholars in Beijing, fresh off their victory over Sven Hedin, have agitated against him in his absence and gotten the warlord to detain his collections of artifacts and fossils if they aren't shared with the Chinese. Andrews reacts with indignation, dismissing the Chinese scholars as, quote, returned students who absorbed a superficial level of Western culture and suffered from an inferiority complex. Walter Granger, a colleague of Andrews and a frequent participant in his expeditions, said that submission to Chinese demands would reduce the Central Asiatic expeditions to little more than, quote, Roy's charity organization. And it's Roy Chapman Andrews and Langdon Warner, two of the three most important players in the era of obstruction, who between them exchange the Saturday Evening Post cartoon in the November 12th, 1937 issue that I led off episode 1 in describing, in which you have the three black men in a tribal canoe and dressed in loincloth and, pierced nose and all this sort of stuff. They show up on a dock in the Hudson River in New York with the Statue of Liberty in the background, and an African-American janitor or porter of some sort talks to a smartly dressed white man and says, he say day is an expedition, come here to get stuff for day museum. Where did I find that cartoon? I wasn't flipping through randomly 1937 issues of the Saturday Evening Post, in case you were wondering. I was going through the archives of Roy Chapman Andrews in the American Museum of Natural History in New York one day, and I saw that cartoon there, cut out, so I had no idea what magazine it came from, wedged in between two letters from Langdon Warner, up in Harvard. Langdon Warner, and those letters were dated in 1937, so I thought, okay, this must be a 1937 cartoon, and I looked for it and I found it. And you can imagine Langdon Warner is almost certainly has sent this cartoon. He's cut it out of the Saturday Evening Post and sent it to his good friend Roy Chapman Andrews in New York, and they are both commiserating. They're both sharing a good laugh at the absurdity in their eyes that non-white people would do expeditions. Because as everyone knows, expeditions are what civilized white men do in dark, uncivilized lands. That era was over by the time of the Saturday Evening Post cartoon. But the Westerners who grew up in a different age were not willing to admit that. And they still laughed at the idea that there could be any sort of role reversal with the non-Western natives. Finally, we have to discuss Aurel Stein. Aurel Stein, the granddaddy of all the Silk Road archaeologists. He decides to do his fourth expedition to Xinjiang in 1930. He also has been gone for 15 years. The last expedition, his third one, ended in 1915. And the people at Harvard, having seen that Langdon Warner has failed, and Hedin has been bound up by unacceptable conditions, and Roy Chapman Andrews has failed, they say, if we're going to fill the shelves of the Fogg Museum, let's go to Aurel Stein. Now Sir Aurel Stein, the most famous archaeologist of the Silk Road. If anyone can do it, it's him. Now 68 years old, Aurel Stein was thought to be the only man capable of succeeding where everyone else had stumbled. It was his special connections, all those letters I read to you, with Chinese officials in Xinjiang that we explored in the previous episode, that instilled confidence in his backers. The funding for Stein's fourth and final expedition to Xinjiang came mainly from Harvard. The goal was to fill the Fogg Museum with Gandharan art, Greco-Indian, Chinese, Buddhist art, fusion art. Fill the Fogg Museum with Gandharan art and antiquities that Warner did not get in 1925. Everyone knew what had happened to Warner, Hedin, and Andrews. They weren't in the dark. They simply thought that Stein could overcome it all with all of his connections. Stein's fourth expedition takes place against a very unique geopolitical backdrop. For the first time since 1916, China once again has a viable central government in Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party. Okay. Surprisingly enough, though, this made little difference in the procurement of a passport or a visa. Like the warlord governments before it, the new nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, it's actually called the nationalist government in English with a capital N. I know it's not kind of confusing because we talk about nationalism so much. In Chinese, it's the Kuomintang Party. Like the warlord governments before it, the new nationalist government at Nanjing, that's the new capital, they moved the capital away from Beijing, also issued a visa to Stein without any fuss. Like Andrews, Stein also avoided all public fanfare this time around. He did not contact any Chinese scholarly organization and made no attempt to hire a Chinese co-director who would be equal to him in power. Those are the terms set by Hedin that any future explorer would have to adhere to. He doesn't do that. So why does Nanjing issue his visa so easily? Even Stein himself was, quote, pleasantly surprised by easily secured result, as he writes in his diary when he visits Nanjing and meets with the nationalist brass. My theory rests upon two motives, and I actually wrote a whole article about this one time. The first is the continued desire by the new regime, the Nationalist Party, to be viewed as a friend of science, just like we've seen that before in the Compensations of Plunder. We're a brand new regime, we want to be seen as modern, and so we're going to support an expedition that claims to be purely scientific in nature. But the second and far more important reason, I think, is the continued warlordism that plagued China in all the lands not controlled by Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party. If you look at a map, and obviously you can't look at one on this podcast, but if you look at a map of China in 1930, you'll see that the Nationalist Party, Chiang Kai-shek's government, only controls a pitifully small sliver of land in the vicinity of Nanjing and Shanghai. That's it. The rest of the country is still run by warlords, tens of warlords, okay? And they all pay lip service to the new nationalist government. They all say they're loyal to it, but in reality, they continue to run their internal affairs in their own jurisdictions as they see fit. So the nationalist government, when Stein comes back in 1930, it wants to exert its control and expand its actual sovereignty on the ground over all these other warlord domains. Xinjiang is ruled by a warlord as well. That's where the Silk Road expeditions are and where Stein is going to go. Okay? And so what I think is happening here is that the nationalists are still seeing in Stein the possibility of extracting a form of diplomatic capital. That is to say, they want to be able to impose upon the warlord of Xinjiang, who they have zero actual administrative control over, they want to impose upon him a symbolic proxy through Stein, someone who has a legitimate scientific pretext to enter the province. They want to be able to force the warlord, Jin Shuren of Xinjiang province, to accept the marching papers issued by the central government in Nanjing. It's a way of imposing symbolic authority over the warlord of Xinjiang. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on here. But it's not going to work. In summer of 1930, just as Stein is crossing the Himalayas from Kashmir in India into Xinjiang, the newly formed National Commission for the Preservation of Antiquities in Beijing learns of his secret visit to Nanjing to procure a visa and promptly raises the alarm. In a public press release designed to shame Chiang Kai-shek's government into compliance, just like it shamed previous warlords, and turned support of Stein into political suicide, 19 of the most eminent scholars in China accuse him of having engaged in, quote, commercial vandalism on his first 3 expeditions. Stein's acquisition of 10,000 manuscripts from the cave library at Dunhuang in 1907 was described as, quote, a dishonorable act, one that Stein gleefully recounted in his books without the least shame. One Chinese archaeologist, knowing nothing about the compensations of plunder barter arrangement that had enabled Stein's first 3 expeditions 20-30 years ago, went on record to declare that all of Stein's previous exploits in Xinjiang were the fruits of imperialist deceit and domestic corruption. Ah, Mr. Stein, are you really going to pull out that old deceitful bunk that tricked us 20 years ago to try to trick us again? Proclaiming that his government had, quote, already killed off the corrupt officials of the old regime, Wu insisted, Wu is the author of this tract, the author insists that the Chinese of his generation would adamantly, quote, oppose the methods of Stein-style archaeology, walk 10,000 miles, steal 10,000 manuscripts, and write 10,000 boring articles. With that, Chiang Kai-shek's government had to reverse its stance or risk political suicide. So they take the natural course. In spring of 1931, they cancel Stein's passport and order him to leave the country. From Stein's perspective, the sense of betrayal was acute. As he leaves China for the last time, this time in disgrace, the old Hungarian British explorer deplored, quote, the obstacles which unjustified agitation has raised against the continued work of a confrere who had done as much as anyone to throw light on the great and beneficial part played by ancient China in the history of Central Asia. In Stein's eyes, he was a confrere of China, a colleague. The cosmopolitan Confucian elite of old China would have fully concurred with that statement, as we saw in episode 3. They weren't corrupt. They had a rational perception of the value of the resources that were being exchanged. But the nationalist Chinese intellectuals of young China, as Stein called them, did not. To them, he was a criminal. Such was the dramatic transformation wrought by the power of nationalist ideas, all in the course of a single generation. Now, the timing of the end of Western archaeological expeditions, unilateral Western archaeological expeditions, let's put it that way. Western expeditions that, from start to finish, are formulated and undertaken really without input from anyone else, and they do as they please. Okay? The end of those types of Western archaeological expeditions, where almost all the spoils will go back to Western museums, the timing is curious, in light of when the most famous archaeologist of all, Indiana Jones, the cinematic Indiana Jones, was said to be in the prime of his career. As we already hinted at, 1936 is when the first film begins. Now, isn't that strange? Because we know by 1936 the obstruction is over, the action's over. So, knowing what we know now, in our final episode, Did Hollywood Get It Right?, we will point out where fiction diverges from fact, where we might still find serendipitous convergence of fact and fiction, where the franchise indulges in some ugly stereotypes and assumptions that the filmmakers inherit from some of the most famous archaeologists themselves. Hello, James Henry Breasted. Along with my, much awaited, I'm sure, unveiling of a proposal for the 5th Indiana Jones film, a plot that would be good for history, good for political correctness, and good for business as well. Next time, did Hollywood get it right? I'll save you the suspense. No, but the story of how they didn't get it right is utterly fascinating, as is some of the small little tweaks they could have made to get it right.